Every day we hear about Ukraine. Freezing rain falling into trenches, missile strikes, civilians tortured and murdered, cities, schools, museums, and libraries destroyed, 500 churches and religious sites obliterated. Several 100,000 people have perished there in only 1 year. And so lately, trying to make sense of this and to understand, I have been reading the poetry of Czeslaw Milosz, the famous Polish poet. Milosz was about 14 years old during World War I when the German army invaded Vilnius. He was there with his mother because his father had been conscripted by the Russians. Later, in the Polish-Soviet War in 1919, he and his mother were fired on by troops. And then throughout World War II, Milosz secretly helped Jewish families to survive. He witnessed Nazi soldiers burning down Warsaw in August of 1944. And this is what he writes. I do not regret those years in Warsaw, which was, I believe, the most agonizing spot in the whole of terrorized Europe. Had I chosen emigration, my life would certainly have followed a very different course. But my knowledge of the crimes which Europe has witnessed in the 20th century would be less direct, less concrete than it is. After the war, for 6 years, Milosz served as the cultural attaché for the People's Republic of Poland until he made outspoken criticisms of the Soviet leadership, and it made it necessary for him to defect to the West. He ended up having a very long career at the University of California, Berkeley, and some of his faculty colleagues, when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1980, were surprised because they did not even know that he was a poet. He wrote in Polish, so Americans couldn't understand what he said. And people in Poland, they couldn't read it either because he was censored. He writes as a refugee and as an immigrant. And this sermon has more of his poems than I've ever put of poetry into a sermon before. I'm going to begin with his poem, Faithful Mother Tongue. Faithful Mother Tongue, I have been serving you. Every night I used to set before you little bowls of colors so you could have your birch, your cricket, your finch as preserved in my memory. You were my native land. He goes on. Now I confess my doubt. There are moments when it seems to me I have squandered my life. For you are the tongue of the debased, of the unreasonable, hating themselves even more than they hate other nations, a tongue of informers, a tongue of the confused, ill with their own innocence. But without you, who am I? Milosz persists in this lonely work because he does not want to forget what has happened. And he writes about terrible destruction and cruelty. This is another poem he wrote. You who wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at the crime, and kept a pack of fools around you to mix good and evil, to blur the line. Though everyone bowed down before you, saying, virtue and wisdom lit your way, do not feel safe. The poet remembers. You can kill one, but another is born. So why would I spend so much time deep into this reflection on human depravity? And I'll tell you, in part, it's because of Milosz's deep Christian faith. His belief helps him to see the beauty of the world even in the midst of stark suffering. So I'm going to share this poem. It's called Veni Creator, Come Spirit. It's the music we sing when someone's ordained. And this is what he writes. Come, Holy Spirit, bending or not bending the grasses, appearing or not above our heads in a tongue of flame, at hay harvest, or when they plow in the orchards, or when snow covers crippled firs in the Sierra Nevada. I am only a man. I need visible signs. I tire easily building the stairway of abstraction. Many a time I asked you, you know it well, that the statue in the church lift its hand only once, just once, for me. But I understand that signs must be human. Therefore, call one man anywhere on earth, not me, after all, I have some decency, and allow me, when I look at him, to marvel at you. For Christians, the one who helps us to marvel at God is Jesus. And if we had only this one story this morning of Jesus with the Samaritan woman, and that was all we had from the Bible forever, that would be enough. Jesus talks longer to her than to his friends, the disciples, or to his family, or when he's defending himself in front of the authorities. She is the first person that he reveals himself to, the first one to realize who he is. She is the first person to tell others about Jesus, the first preacher, and we follow in her footsteps this morning. And so in a sign of respect for her, rather than calling her the Samaritan woman, let us give her a name and call her Leah for the sake of our conversation this morning. Now, recently, under pressure from the governor's office, the Florida Department of Education lobbied the College Board to remove certain ideas and methodologies from the advanced placement exam for the course in African American Studies. And one of the most important concepts that was erased is called intersectionality. Raise your hand if you know what intersectionality is. That's amazing. That's great that you've heard about it. It comes from the thinker Kimberly Crenshaw, and she wrote about it in 1989, and it's a very simple idea. She points out that race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., that they intersect and uniquely shape our experience. So it means that if you are a wealthy, black, cisgendered, middle-aged man, that the world will look very different to you than it would to a black, trans teenager living on the streets of San Francisco. Now, of all the people for Jesus to talk to, Leah is a particularly interesting choice. So taking an intersectional approach, Leah is a triple outsider. First, she's a Samaritan. Samaritans were ostracized, regarded as a mixed-race people, descended from an Assyrian invaders and from the Jews who were left behind in the Babylonian captivity. The ancient historian Josephus writes about how Jews and Samaritans hated and murdered each other. Second, Leah is a woman. Women were not allowed to participate in public life. Every morning, faithful Jewish men would pray, and part of their morning prayer was, "Thank you, God, for not making me a woman." Women were regarded as dangerous. Religious leaders were not allowed to talk to women in public, not even their own wives. An intersectional approach shows us that Samaritan women were particularly regarded as unclean permanently. Jews did not share drinking vessels with any Samaritans because according to the Mishnah, Tractate Nida 4:1, quote, Samaritan women are deemed menstruants from the cradle. In other words, Samaritan women were polluted permanently, unable to be made clean. Now finally, third, Leah is a disgraced woman. The others all make it their visit to the well in the morning, and they chat and talk and visit with one another, but Leah is not welcome with them. Instead, she has to come alone at noon. She is the one they're chatting about. And the reason is she has had 5 husbands and lives with a man who is not her husband now. That is a picture of who Leah is. She's a woman who's used to being avoided. And she and Jesus They have every reason to stay away from each other. And how surprising it must have been when Jesus, with compassion in his eyes and in his voice, asks her for a drink of water. She must have been so surprised. Is this person lost? She knows that there are rules that the Jews have that mean that they can't share a drinking vessel. And then they talk. And against all expectations, because Jesus is talking in very symbolic language, Leah understands what he's saying. She understands and she wants that living water that he offers her. She says, "Sir, give me this water." And then the subject abruptly changes and Jesus asks her about her husband. Now at this turning point, she has a choice. She can either say something like, "I thought we were talking about religion. Why are you getting so personal?" Or she can lie. So she said, "I have no husband," which is literally true, but only barely. And Jesus tells her the rest of the truth about herself. So in other words, instead of pulling away, Jesus, in his love for her, draws nearer. And all of a sudden, she finds it all overwhelming, and she tries to change the subject again back to religion and that old debate between the Jews and the Samaritans. She probably thinks that if Jesus knows about the husbands, he's going to know pretty much everything else too. And she hopes to use this debate to confuse matters, to help her step away from him and hide. But it doesn't work. When she steps back, Jesus moves closer to her. He will not let her simply slip away. Just as she tries to hide herself, he will show her who he really is. She says, "I know the Messiah is coming." And Jesus says, "I am he." Now, this is the first time he has told anyone, and it is a moment of complete honesty. The triple outsider and the Messiah, they encounter each other with no pretenses. All the rules, the taboos, the prejudices, the history, all of it falls away, forgotten. So Jesus shows Leah who she really is. Beyond all possible identities, she is a child of God. And this is true today too. The Messiah is the one in whose presence we know who we really are. We come face to face with what is good in us, with what is bad in us, and with what our possibilities are for the future. The Messiah shows us ourselves by crossing all boundaries, breaking all rules, and speaking to us like someone who has known us for our entire life. And when we know we are children of God, we can go back to face people who we thought we never could face again. We can go and say with courage, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done." Now, as a deeply faithful Christian poet, Czeslaw Milosz understood the way that Jesus gives us the possibility of a new beginning, beyond all the identities that we claim and all the identities that are put on us. He writes about this in one of his last poems. It's called Late Ripeness. It's the last poem in the book. "Not soon. As late as the approach of my 90th year, I felt a door opening in me, and I entered the clarity of early morning. One after another, my former lives were departing like ships, together with their sorrow. And the countries, cities, gardens, the bays of seas assigned to my brush became closer, ready now to be described better than they were ever before. I was not separated from people. Grief and pity joined us. We forget, I kept saying, that we are all children of the King. For where we came from, there is no division into yes and no, into is, was, and will be. I knew always that I would be a worker in the vineyard, as are all men and women living at the same time, whether they are aware of it or not. I have learned so much from Jesus, from that long-distant Samaritan woman, and from Czeslaw, Milosz. There is living water in the most agonizing spot in terrorized Europe. Even when we are isolated by loneliness, surrounded by strangers who do not understand, we have a visible sign. The statue lifts its hand, and we no longer have to be separated from others. God is spirit, and we are all children of the King. Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done.